The foreman, red-faced and yelling, pointed at the stack of warped lumber I just cut, calling me a damn blind idiot in front of the entire crew. My pay was docked for the day, leaving me a few dollars short for rent, and I saw the smirk on his face as he walked away, muttering, "Some men just ain't cut out for this." The smell of jet fuel still clung to my clothes when I got home from another business trip. Houston was a long way from the quiet prairies I'd known, but the work at EXJ Valve paid the bills. My dogs, two German short-haired pointers, met me at the door with a flurry of paws and wet noses, their loyalty a solid, uncomplicated thing. I often thought they understood more than most people I ran into on these trips, which was usually just about everyone. The road held little appeal anymore. It was just an extension of the bomb, a necessary evil, and I counted the days until I could be back in my own chair with my dogs at my feet. Before Houston, before EXJ, my hands had known the rough grain of timber. I'd started young, barely out of high school, in a sawmill back in South Dakota. The noise was constant, the work brutal, but it was honest. For a short while, I tried logging for myself, hauling equipment into the Black Hills, dreaming of my own timber truck. That ended with a broken axle and a mountain of debt, a stark lesson in the difference between ambition and capital. I learned then that stable work, even if it meant punching a clock for someone else, was a kind of freedom too. It bought you groceries and kept a roof over your head. That stability was where Mike Olson came in, my childhood friend, now a manager at EXJ. Mike had always had a way with people, a smooth talker who could charm the paint off a wall. He wore tailored shirts and a confident smile, always seemed to know the right thing to say, or more importantly, when to say nothing at all. He had an easy confidence that I, a man who preferred the honest grind of the shop floor, could never quite replicate. We were different men now, both working for the same company, but moving in different orbits. Our boss was Gary Davis, the plant manager. Gary was a portly man, always wearing a suit that seemed a size too small, and his face was perpetually a shade of red. He was big on health, always leaving memos about wellness programs in the break room, even as he chewed on a greasy pastry during our morning meetings. Gary was also tight with the dollar, always finding a way to shave costs, even if it meant cutting corners that made the engineers wince. He carried a Bible to work, kept it on his desk, a testament to his faith. He often spoke about moral character, about doing the right thing, which always struck me as rich, coming from him. Then there was Susan, Gary's wife, elegant, with a quiet grace that seemed out of place next to Gary's booming voice and boisterous laugh. And Mike. The two of them were an open secret at EXJ, especially around the holidays. Every year, same scene. The company Christmas party was where it played out, almost like a ritual. Mike would always make a point of dancing with Susan. Gary, oblivious or perhaps willfully blind, would be in a corner, nursing a drink, talking shop with some supplier or another, lost in the details of valve production and profit margins. As soon as Gary's back was turned, as soon as he was deep into some technical discussion, Mike and Susan would disappear. Not overtly, never a grand exit, but a slow fade. One minute they were there, Mike's hand lingering on the small of her back as they talked. The next, they were gone. It was a pattern, predictable as the changing seasons. The restrooms, the coat closet, sometimes the parking lot if the weather held. Everyone knew, or at least suspected, but no one ever said a word. Not to Gary, not to Mike. For a few years, the parties were held in the large conference room upstairs at the plant. Then, about 5 years ago, Gary announced the Christmas party would be at the Hilton downtown in one of their banquet rooms. The office speculation started almost immediately. Some of us figured Susan was tired of the office furniture, or maybe Mike just wanted a place with easier access to the elevators. It was the kind of joke whispered over coffee cups, never loud enough for Gary to hear, but everyone got the drift. I stopped going to those parties years ago. It was cheaper to stay home and drink a couple of beers in my own living room than to witness the annual charade. Besides, the small talk always felt like pulling teeth, especially with people who believed their own lies. Gary, the great judge of men, the man who read scripture every morning, let Mike, his smooth-talking subordinate, around his wife, unsupervised. He was blind to the flirtation, the lingering touches, the way Susan's eyes always sought out Mike in a crowded room. Gary believed in God, but he didn't seem to believe what was right in front of his face. He never saw it, not truly. Mike and I had a standing joke back in our younger days, a kind of dark pact. By the time we hit 40, we swore we'd have entertained every woman in Houston, or at least a good many of them. It was the kind of boast young men made, full of bravado and cheap beer. We'd chased our share of skirts, me with a more direct, less subtle approach, Mike with his polished charm. So when Mike showed up at my 30th birthday party with Sarah on his arm, introducing her as his fiancée, I nearly choked on my whiskey. She wasn't his type, not even close. His usual conquests were, as I like to put it, an empty-headed pair of boobs. Women whose deepest conversations revolved around their nail polish and what new show was on TV. Sarah was different. She stood tall with a quiet strength that emanated from her, even in the crowded, noisy bar. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and she carried herself with an understated grace. She wasn't loud. She didn't try to dominate the conversation. But when she spoke, you listened. I watched her that night, watched her interact with Mike, and saw a side of him I hadn't known existed. He was calmer, more attentive, less the peacock I was used to. I couldn't wait to get him on the golf course to get the real story, away from the loud music and the prying eyes. But Sarah, she was an open book, or at least she was willing to share. We were sitting at a small table, a little removed from the main festivities, and she smiled as she recounted their first meeting. It had been at some management conference in Dallas, a chaotic affair. She described Mike as a bumbling goon who had scattered all her meticulously organized notes across the floor in the lobby. He'd been apologetic, she said, genuinely so, and insisted on buying her coffee as an apology. That coffee turned into dinner, and then another. Her architecture firm, it turned out, was just a few blocks from AXJ Valve, and their budding romance found fertile ground in the concrete jungle of downtown Houston. She told the story with a self-deprecating humor that made me laugh, a genuine laugh. Over the next few months, as the wedding plans solidified, I found myself genuinely liking Sarah. Not in a shake-the-sheets way, never that, but more like loving a sister, a protective kind of affection. She was good for Mike, a steadying force against his more impulsive nature. She saw past the smooth talk, saw the good in him, and she deserved good herself. I saw in her a kind of decency that was rare, especially in the circles Mike and I had moved in for so long. The wedding was a grand affair, held at some fancy country club outside the city. Mike, in his perfectly tailored suit, looked like a magazine ad. Sarah, in her white dress, looked radiant, truly happy. I danced with her, a slow country shuffle, careful not to step on her dress. She smelled of lilies and something clean, something hopeful. As the song ended, I steered Mike away from the celebratory crowd towards a quieter corner near the bar. "Listen, Mike," I started, my voice low, firm, making sure he understood the seriousness of the moment. I looked him dead in the eye, letting him see the conviction there. "If you ever hurt Sarah, I swear I'll beat the crap out of you." It wasn't a threat made lightly. It was a promise. I knew Mike, knew his past, and I knew Sarah deserved better than that. He just shrugged, a slight, almost imperceptible movement of his shoulders, and grinned. "Don't worry, Jim. My days of sodomy are over." He clapped me on the back like it was a joke, like it was nothing. My own bachelor days, the ones filled with late nights and easy women, were still in full swing. I was still sowing my wild oats, as my old man used to say. But even in my wildness, there were lines I wouldn't cross. I'd had my share of casual relationships, too many to count, and I'd poured my share of whiskey down my throat. My personal rule, however, was as solid as concrete. Never ever mess with a married woman. The consequences weren't worth it. I'd seen it play out before. I remembered a night at a dive bar in Deer Park, smoky and loud. A woman, attractive in a faded sort of way, had been flirting with me all night. I knew she was married. Her wedding ring was prominent, despite her attempts to hide it with her thumb. She told me her husband was on a fishing trip. We were laughing, a little too close, when the bar door swung open. Her husband wasn't on a fishing trip. He stood there, a stocky man with a face like thunder, a .38 special clutched in his hand. Your husband's unhappy, I'd muttered to her, pushing my chair back with a scrape that cut through the sudden silence. The air in the bar went cold. I'd move fast, out the back door and into the humid Texas night, the sound of glass shattering behind me. That night had etched a permanent line in my mind, a boundary I would never cross again. Some lessons you only needed to learn once. The years after Mike and Sarah's wedding settled into a rhythm. They bought a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, planted a small garden. Mike seemed to shed some of his wilder edges, replaced by a quieter, more grounded version of himself. He still had his charm, but it felt less like a weapon and more like a natural extension of his personality. Sarah, meanwhile, blossomed. Her architecture firm, once a dream, became a reality, opening a local branch that quickly gained a reputation for elegant, understated designs. Sometimes over lunch, she'd sketch out ideas on a napkin for me, explaining the lines and angles with a passion that was infectious. I enjoyed those conversations, watching her intellect at work. Mike, to all outward appearances, was content. He spoke about their plans for the future, the renovations they wanted to do on the house, the possibility of starting a family. Yet sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, I'd catch a flicker in his eyes, a restless, distant look, like he was scanning the horizon for something he couldn't quite name. It was brief, always, just a ghost of the old Mike, the one who sought out thrill and novelty. The company Christmas parties continued, year after year, in that same Hilton banquet room. But the dynamic had shifted. Mike made a point of avoiding Susan. Susan in turn kept her distance from Mike. They barely acknowledged each other beyond a polite, professional nod. It was almost like a performance, I mused to myself, watching them from across the room, like they knew everyone was watching, had seen the old spectacle, and so they played it straight, careful not to give anyone a reason to talk. It was a change, certainly, but one that left me with a lingering sense of unease. It felt too deliberate, too perfect. Then the late nights started. First it was once a week, then twice. Mike would come in looking tired, sometimes with a faint smell of stale restaurant air clinging to his clothes. He'd offer vague excuses. Big project, Jim. Client dinner ran late. Or had to pull some numbers for Gary, you know how he is. Sarah, bless her heart, initially dismissed them, brushing off my mild questions with an easy smile. She attributed it to Mike's ambitious drive, his dedication to the company. But even she couldn't hide the subtle undercurrent of tension that began to emerge, a slight tightening around her mouth when she spoke about his schedule. One evening after work, Sarah called me. Her voice was quiet, hesitant. "Jim, can I ask you something?" She sounded troubled. "Mike, he's always on his phone now, and he keeps it out of my sight, always facing down or tucked away." I heard the unspoken question in her voice, the doubt. "He's just busy, Sarah," I said, trying to reassure her, trying to convince myself. But a familiar knot of unease tightened in my gut, a premonition of trouble, an old, cold feeling. Around the same time, I started seeing Susan more frequently in the office. Not just at the Christmas party. She'd come in ostensibly for meetings with Gary to discuss some administrative details, or so Gary would say. But her gaze, I noticed, often lingered on Mike's office door, a beat too long, a glint in her eyes that was hard to miss. She'd sit in the waiting area, sipping coffee, her eyes darting towards his office whenever the door opened. One afternoon, I was walking past Mike's office, heading to the break room, when I heard hushed voices in the hallway. Mike and Susan. They were standing close, their shoulders almost touching. Their voices were too low to understand the words, but the intensity of their body language was clear. Heads bent together, a hand briefly touching an arm, a quick, almost imperceptible glance around before they pulled apart as I rounded the corner. Mike caught my eye, a quick, almost defensive flash. "Just work stuff, Jim," he said a little too quickly, a little too loud. I just nodded, feigning indifference, and kept walking. Sarah's subtle questions became more frequent. "Jim, has Mike mentioned anything about a big new client in Galveston? Or he's been real tired lately. Is work at the plant particularly demanding right now?" She wasn't accusing, not yet. Her voice held a blend of concern and something else. A nascent suspicion, a quiet dread that hadn't quite fully formed. I found myself caught in the middle between my long-standing loyalty to Mike, my best friend since we were kids, and my protective feelings for Sarah, this good woman I had come to care for like a sister. It was a silent, growing burden, heavy in my chest. The big projects became a staple in Mike's vocabulary, trotted out with increasing frequency, yet they felt thinner each time, less believable. His phone calls grew guarded. He'd often step out of the office to take them or speak in hushed tones, turning his back if I was nearby. When he was home, Sarah said, his demeanor with her had become distant, distracted. He was there, but not entirely present. One Tuesday, I was grabbing a quick sandwich from a deli across town, a place far from the usual EXJ haunts. As I waited for my order, I saw them, Mike and Susan. They were seated at a quiet table in the back, leaning in close, their heads almost touching. The way Susan laughed, a soft, intimate sound, and the way Mike's hand briefly covered hers on the table, it wasn't a business lunch, not by a long shot. A pang of dread, cold and familiar, settled in my gut. Later that week, I decided to test the waters, a subtle probe. I cornered Mike by the coffee machine, trying to keep my voice casual. "You still playing those silly games, Mike?" I asked, my gaze unwavering, letting him know I wasn't just talking about golf. He grew defensive immediately, his eyes narrowing. "What games, Jim? It's work. You wouldn't understand management stuff." His voice was sharper than usual, a quick snap of annoyance. The familiar Mike, the one who deflected and charmed his way out of anything, was back. I just nodded, letting it drop, but the weight of my wedding day warning felt heavy and imminent in the air between us. The promise to beat the crap out of him if he ever hurt Sarah. It felt closer now than it ever had. The real blow came a few days later. Sarah called me, her voice tight, brittle with suppressed tears. She'd found an old receipt. "He said he was working late that night," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "He forgot to mention the fancy dinner." The receipt was for Antoine's, a place with white tablecloths and prices that would make your eyes water. Mike had claimed he never had time to take her there, always too busy, too tired. The date on the receipt was recent, a damning piece of evidence that solidified her worst fears. I recognized the blatant lie for what it was, a cheap deception. Seeing the deep hurt in Sarah's eyes, the way her shoulders trembled even over the phone, my old disgust for Mike's infidelity resurfaced, sharp and acrid. It was the same feeling I had watching him with Susan at those Christmas parties, only now it was personal, tied to someone I cared about. Meanwhile, Gary Davis remained oblivious, a thick, impenetrable wall of self-importance. He'd often stop by my workbench, puffing out his chest to boast about Susan's dedication to her civic duties. "She's out at those charity events till all hours," he'd say proudly, completely unaware of her true activities, convinced his wife was tirelessly serving the community. The irony wasn't lost on me. It was a cruel joke, played on a man too vain and too self-absorbed to notice. Sarah, driven by a gnawing suspicion that refused to be silenced, started occasionally following Mike's car. She'd drive past the places he claimed to be, checking for his car in the parking lots. She never found anything concrete, nothing undeniable that she could confront him with. But the lack of evidence didn't ease her mind. It only solidified her doubts, turning them into a cold, hard certainty. Each unanswered question, each vague excuse from Mike chipped away at her trust, leaving her raw and exposed. Then, late one night, my phone rang. It was Mike. His voice was slurred, thick with alcohol. He was rambling, vague confessions tumbling out in disconnected sentences about mistakes and regrets. He didn't mention Susan or Sarah or any specific incident, just a general, profound sense of having messed things up. I just listened, stone-faced, leaning against my kitchen counter, offering no comfort, no words of absolution. "I messed up, Jim. Real bad," he slurred. And then, abruptly, the line went dead. The silence that followed was chilling, filled with a sense of foreboding that settled deep in my bones. The office gossip, which had quieted down to a low hum, began to stir again. Hushed whispers in the break room, knowing glances exchanged when Mike or Susan walked by. The air at XJ valve grew heavy with unspoken knowledge. I felt a growing sense of responsibility, a burden pressing down on me. I knew I couldn't keep Sarah in the dark much longer. The truth was coming, an inevitable wave, and I dreaded the fallout it would bring. Sarah's intuition, sharpened by weeks of vague unease, finally hit its breaking point. One morning as she folded Mike's laundry, a distinct, unfamiliar perfume clung to his dress shirt. It was floral, with an undertone of something musky, definitely not her own. Her hands paused, the fabric feeling suddenly foreign, contaminated. The scent, subtle but undeniable, was a physical manifestation of her deepest fears. That evening she confronted him. Her voice, though trembling, was firm, stripped of its usual warmth. "Are you seeing someone else, Mike?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Mike's reaction was immediate, violent. His anger flared, his face reddening. He vehemently denied it, accusing her of paranoia, of distrust, of imagining things. "You're imagining things, Sarah. You're crazy. It's just work, I told you." He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I happened to be driving by their house later that night, heading home from a supply run when I saw them. They were outside on the front lawn, locked in a tense, hushed argument. Mike's posture was rigid, his arms crossed. Sarah's face was drawn, etched with pain, the streetlights catching the shimmer of tears in her eyes. She looked up and saw my truck slow down. Our eyes met across the dim yard. "He's lying, Jim," she pleaded, her voice barely audible, a desperate cry for confirmation. I saw the raw hurt, the betrayal, but caught in the glare of my headlights, caught between my long-standing loyalty to Mike and the protective affection I felt for her, I remained agonizingly silent. I just drove past, the heavy weight of my inaction pressing down on me. Gary, still profoundly oblivious, continued his routine at work. He even approached me one morning, complaining about personal drama, interfering with productivity in other departments. He spoke of restless spirits and unprofessional conduct, completely unaware that the very tragedy he was pontificating about was unfolding in his own home. He was a blind prophet, warning others of a fire that was already consuming his own house. A few days later, Sarah took the plunge. Her heart pounded as she secretly accessed Mike's work phone, guided by a desperation she hadn't known she possessed. What she found there hit her like a physical blow. A cache of incriminating texts between him and Susan. Dates, Liam's secret rendezvous, thinly veiled declarations of affection. The truth, stark and undeniable, laid bare on the glowing screen. "Susan," she whispered, the name a bitter taste on her tongue, her world collapsing around her. "It's Susan." She called me almost immediately, her voice hollow and broken, devoid of its usual life. "You knew, didn't you, Jim, all this time? You knew." The accusation hung in the air, deserved and sharp. Racked with guilt, I finally admitted my suspicions, the pieces I'd seen, the conversations I'd overheard. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," I said, my voice heavy. "I never had concrete proof, nothing I felt I could act on without ruining everything." A poor excuse, I knew, even as I spoke it. Mike, sensing the net tightening around him, perhaps from Sarah's icy distance or a slip of the tongue, grew frantic. He attempted to delete messages, to cover his tracks, but it was already too late. The digital breadcrumbs were too numerous, too deeply embedded. He was trying to close the barn door after the horses had bolted. At the same time, Susan, feeling Mike's increasing withdrawal, grew desperate. Her attempts to capture his attention became bolder, more obvious at work. Lingering by his office door, finding excuses to pass by his desk, her voice a little too loud when she spoke to him in the hallway. And then, slowly, Gary finally started to notice. Susan's strange behavior, her evasiveness, her guarded answers to his questions about her civic duties. He still attributed it to stress. "She's just working too hard, bless her heart," he'd tell me, shaking his head. But a flicker of something, a nascent doubt, had entered his eyes. The atmosphere in the office became thick with unspoken tension, a palpable unease. Everyone but Gary seemed to know that something dramatic was about to break. Sarah, heartbroken but now resolute, moved with a quiet, methodical determination. The initial devastation had given way to a steely resolve. She began quietly and systematically gathering more evidence, compiling a meticulous record of Mike's lies and Susan's involvement. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was planning. As the storm gathers, stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The confrontation between Sarah and Mike was, by her account, devoid of dramatics. She laid out the evidence with the methodical precision of a prosecutor. The texts printed out, time-stamped, the restaurant receipts, cross-referenced with Mike's supposed late nights, a clear, undeniable timeline of his deception with Susan. There was no room for denial, no corner left for him to hide in. Mike, utterly cornered, first tried denial, his voice cracking. Those are old, Sarah, or just innocent work talks. Then he shifted to minimization. It meant nothing, Sarah. Just a mistake, a moment of weakness. Please forgive me. He pleaded, his usual charm replaced by a desperate, pathetic whine. Sarah's response was chillingly calm, delivered with a quiet, devastating finality. It meant our marriage, Mike, and you threw it away for nothing. The words cut through his pleas, precise and sharp, leaving him with no defense. The very next evening, fate, or perhaps just cruel irony, delivered its own brutal revelation. Gary Davis, the perpetually oblivious plant manager, was making one of his infrequent after-hours rounds, checking on some inventory. He pushed open the door to a rarely used, secluded office, a storage room, really, tucked away on the second floor. What he saw there shattered his world. Mike and Susan, in a compromising situation, caught red-handed, their faces frozen in a tableau of guilt and shock. What in the living hell is going on here? Gary's booming voice echoed through the empty hall, a raw, primal sound of disbelief and betrayal. He finally saw the truth with his own eyes, a truth the entire company, it seemed, had known for years. The news spread like wildfire through the plant by the following morning. The whispers turned into open conversations, the knowing glances into outright stares. No one was surprised, only surprised that Gary, of all people, had finally caught on. Susan, flustered and desperate, immediately tried to lie, to deflect blame onto Mike, stammering about being lured and misled. But Gary, his face a mask of shock and profound humiliation, saw through her. His faith, his pride, his very identity as a man of moral character, crumbled before everyone's eyes. I witnessed Gary's public meltdown in the main office the next day. He stood in the middle of the floor, usually a composed, if pompous, figure now utterly broken by the raw betrayal. His face was a furious red, his eyes wide-eyed and vacant. "You snake, Olson! You betrayed me," he shouted, his voice hoarse, pointing an accusing, trembling finger at Mike, who stood a few feet away. Mike, for his part, was frozen. His smooth, confident facade was completely shattered. The man who always had a witty retort, a charming deflection, had nothing. His silence was deafening, a testament to his utter exposure. He just stood there, shoulders slumped, looking like a whipped dog. Sarah, now feeling a bitter vindication amidst her devastation, didn't waste any time. The quiet determination I'd seen in her eyes had hardened into resolve. She began the painful process of separation proceedings immediately. She called me later that week, her voice still raw but stronger now. "There's no going back from this, Jim," she said. "He made his choice, and now he has to live with it." Her words carried the weight of finality, the sound of a door closing forever. I felt a complex mix of emotions, deep sadness for Sarah, who deserves so much more, simmering anger at Mike, my oldest friend, who had squandered everything for a cheap thrill, and a strange, unexpected pity for Gary, a man whose public persona had been so meticulously crafted only to be torn down by the very people he trusted. The revelation of the affair caused a massive upheaval at EXJ Valve, where morale plummeted and trust among employees, already a fragile thing, evaporated. The air was thick with tension, gossip, and the quiet judgment that only comes when private lives become public spectacles. "It's like a bad play," I commented to a coworker, my voice weary, as we watched Gary storm through the office, muttering to himself. "Only it's real, and nobody's laughing anymore." The show had just begun, and the consequences were far from over. The fallout from the affair was swift and brutal, like a storm tearing through a flimsy structure. Gary Davis, his public humiliation still raw, immediately initiated divorce proceedings with Susan. The legal papers cited blatant infidelity, leaving no room for doubt or defense. His anger, once muted by obliviousness, was now a roaring furnace. He wasted no time with Mike either. The dismissal happened publicly, right on the shop floor, witnessed by dozens of stunned colleagues. Gary's face was a mottled red, his voice shaking with a righteous fury I'd never heard. "Get out, Olson! Don't let me ever see your face again!" He pointed a finger that trembled with rage toward the exit. Mike, pale and silent, simply gathered his few belongings and walked out, his head down, the weight of a ruined career heavy on his shoulders. He scrambled desperately to find new work, but his reputation in the industry was irrevocably damaged by the scandal. Houston was a big city, but the circles we moved in were small, and word traveled fast. Sarah, too, moved with quiet resolve. She filed for divorce, seeking not just a fair division of assets, but also, I suspected, a measure of emotional compensation for the profound betrayal. The shared home, the one they had built together, was no longer hers. She packed her things, found a small apartment, and moved out, leaving Mike to face the emptiness he had created. "He'll pay for this, Jim," she said to me, her voice quiet but steely. "He'll pay for all of it, one way or another." I knew she meant every word. Susan, now ostracized by their once vibrant social circle, faced a bitter, protracted divorce from Gary. Her life, once elegant and seemingly secure, was unraveling. The charity events she'd supposedly been so dedicated to now felt like a cruel joke, her reputation in tatters. The plant environment became toxic. Hushed whispers and damning judgments followed Mike and Susan's names wherever they were mentioned. It was as if their presence still tainted the air, even after Mike was gone. HR called me in, asking what I knew and when. I navigated the tricky, uncomfortable waters, trying to be honest without actively implicating Mike more than he already was. It was a tightrope walk between loyalty and truth, and I felt the strain of it deep in my bones. I called Sarah after my HR meeting. "I told you I'd beat the crap out of him if he hurt you," I said, the old warning resurfacing. "Maybe I still will." But the anger was tempered by a profound weariness. The fight had drained me, too. She just sighed, a long, tired sound. "It wouldn't help anything now, Jim." Mike, now jobless, friendless, and alone, started calling me, desperate for any shred of friendship, any familiar voice. "Jim, please, I got nowhere to go," he'd plead, his voice cracking. I felt deeply conflicted. The brokenness in his voice was raw, palpable. This was my oldest friend, the boy I'd grown up with. But the betrayal of Sarah, the woman I had come to care for like a sister, still stung too deeply for easy forgiveness. I mostly just listened, offering little, my silence a form of judgment. The pay the price theme became starkly evident in their lives. Mike and Susan, once intertwined in their secret, now faced professional ruin and profound personal isolation. Their choices had led them down a path with consequences neither of them could have fully foreseen. Gary, though deeply wounded and humiliated, slowly began a path toward reclaiming his dignity. It was a difficult and painful process, watching him try to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. He found solace in his faith, doubled down on his work, even started to lose some of the weight he'd carried for years. It was a long road, but he walked it with a grim determination. I watched the unraveling of multiple lives, Mike's, Sarah's, Susan's, Gary's. It was a stark, sobering reminder of the fragile nature of trust and the devastating cost of lies. It made me reflect on my own life, the choices I'd made, the lines I'd drawn. The chaos they had created was a cautionary tale, playing out in real time. Sarah's divorce proceeded with a grim, determined efficiency. It was contentious, as these things often are, and highly public, given Mike's former position at EXJ Valve. Mike, in a desperate attempt to salvage some shred of his reputation, tried to portray Sarah as overreacting, as overly emotional. But the accumulated evidence, the texts, the receipts, the undeniable timeline of his deception was damning. His flimsy arguments crumbled under the weight of her meticulous presentation. Sarah, a woman of sharp legal and professional acumen, used every tool at her disposal. She meticulously ensured Mike faced significant financial consequences for his actions and deceit. It wasn't about greed, I knew. It was about accountability, about making him feel the sting of what he had taken from her. He thought he could just walk away from it all, Sarah told me one afternoon, her voice firm, resolute. But I'm not that kind of woman. Not anymore. Her words carried the force of a promise. He vowed to herself. Gary Davis, still reeling from the profound humiliation, fueled by a mixture of anger and a deep-seated desire for moral justice, made sure Mike's dismissal wasn't just an internal affair. He saw to it that the details were widely publicized throughout industry circles. He wrote emails, made phone calls, ensured that anyone considering hiring Mike Olson would know precisely why he was suddenly available. Mike's professional reputation, already damaged, was now utterly destroyed. Susan, stripped of her old life, even attempted to reconcile with Gary. She called, she wrote, she showed up at his office, hoping to salvage some part of the life she'd so carelessly discarded. But Gary, his trust shattered beyond any possible repair, was unyielding. "There's no fixing this, Susan," he told her, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "It's done." The door was closed. Mike, unable to secure any work in Houston, faced a stark reality. He considered the desperate measure of leaving town entirely, of starting over somewhere else, a complete unknown. It was a stark contrast to his past ambition, to the man who once had the world at his feet. His easy charm, once his greatest asset, was now viewed with suspicion. I met with Mike a few weeks after the divorce was finalized, at a diner far from EXJ. It wasn't a friendly meeting. I didn't sit across from him as an old friend. I sat as a witness, as someone who had watched him systematically dismantle his own life. The warning I'd given him on his wedding day, the one about beating the crap out of him if he hurt Sarah, had long passed the point of a physical action. The justice was being meted out in other ways, more cutting than any punch. "You made your bed, Mike," I told him, my voice low, weary. "Now you lie in it." He didn't argue. He didn't offer excuses. Utterly defeated and broken, he could only nod slowly, a silent acknowledgement of the truth. "I know, Jim. I know." His eyes, once so bright and full of life, were now hollow. Sarah sold the marital home, a heavy symbol of their broken dreams and shattered future. It was a clean break, a way of severing the last tangible link to the life she had once envisioned. She bought a smaller place in a different part of town, slowly, methodically, beginning to build a new life, brick by painful brick. The revenge in this narrative wasn't violent or dramatic. It was a quiet, methodical dismantling of Mike's life by those he wronged. It was Sarah's legal acumen, Gary's determined character assassination, and the industry's unspoken consensus. It was the slow, agonizing consequence of choices made without regard for others. I reflected on the complex nature of justice and retribution. Was this true justice or just another form of prolonged suffering? It was hard to say. The ripple effects of Mike's affair extended tragically to both his and Sarah's families, who were also grappling with the shame and profound disappointment. Broken relationships, strained ties, the silent judgment of relatives. Gary, though forever scarred by the betrayal, found a new resolve to lead EXJ with integrity. He emerged from the ashes of his personal tragedy as a changed man, perhaps even a better, more self-aware leader. The plant slowly began to heal. The story delved deep into the raw human desire for accountability, when promises are irrevocably broken and lives are irrevocably shattered. It was a harsh lesson, played out for all to see. Months turned into a year. Mike was gone from Houston, a ghost, his whereabouts vague. Susan lived a solitary, diminished life, isolated by community judgment. Sarah, resilient, found strength in her independence. Her architecture, firm, flourished, a testament to renewed purpose. My platonic friendship with Sarah endured, but the brotherly bond with Mike was irrevocably broken. There were no real winners, just survivors. Gary Davis, though scarred, slowly rebuilt his life, finding a quieter, genuine path. I often thought of my wild youth, how narrowly I avoided similar pitfalls. That bar incident, a stark reminder. It unsettled me how good people commit destructive acts, creating echoes through many lives. You try to do right, I mused, but sometimes the world pulls you sideways. I found contentment in my simple life, my toil, my honest work, a profound peace. Wounds may heal, but scars remain. That was the raw truth of human nature, a kind of Midwestern grit.